Hello and welcome to the Edinburgh University History and Games Lab podcast. In this series of episodes, we will be talking to historians, game creators, heritage professionals, and others about history, games, and the places where they meet. So, first of all, everyone, listeners, I have to introduce myself. I am Eduard Gafton. I will be your new host for the podcast, your new producer as well. I am originally from Romania, and I am now currently an MSc Comparative Literature student at the University of Edinburgh. And my academic interests include digital humanities, contemporary literature, experimental fiction, and the avant-garde, and most interestingly to you, interactive fiction. Case in point, I'm now planning a dissertation on interactive fiction, particularly on gamified adaptations of The Hobbit, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, and Around the World in 80 Days. So I have a vast interest in games and in history and in the places where they meet, which is what we will be discussing in today's episode and in the episodes to follow. I also love all games, especially video games, and outside university, I am a writer and contributor for publications such as Double Jump, Smashpad, and CG Magazine. So a lot of games for me, and I want you to think about this as being a new series for the podcast, definitely a new vision, definitely a new producer, but and as much as I can make it a continuation of what we had so far. So if you're familiar with the overall direction of the podcast, this won't change. It will stay the same. So I hope you will feel right at home with a new series, with the new ideas, with a new vision, which is a continuation of what James has been working on. In today's episode, we will talk about historical research and card games as we take a look at Althingi, a Viking card game that was fully backed on Kickstarter. In fact, I'm proud to be here and joined by Joshua Gillingham, creator of and designer of Althingi, which I will now let introduce himself to you. Joshua, if you will.
Hi, Edward. Thanks for having me on today. I'm so glad to be here.
So what can you tell us about yourself, first of all, before we jump into your card game?
I'm a Canadian author and game designer from Nanaimo, BC, right on the west coast of Canada. I've recently launched Althingi on Kickstarter, as you mentioned, which successfully funded in November, despite it being a COVID year. So I can say at least one awesome thing happened in 2020. I'm also the author of the Gatewatch, which is a troll hunting fantasy adventure inspired by the Norse myths and the Icelandic sagas. And I've been working hard on the sequel and the final book in the trilogy as well, which hopefully will be released here sometime in 2021.
Oh, that's wonderful. Exciting. Beyond the card game as well. Listeners, from the Kickstarter page of Althingi, let me read you the brief. So it is a Viking game of strength and influence set in medieval Iceland, where you take on the role of a powerful Icelandic chieftain and vie for influence and power. So let's jump straight into the card game. What is Althingi? What does the name mean? How did you come up with it?
Great question. Well, Althingi is actually still the name of the governmental body in Iceland, and it was funny because as I was advertising the game on social media, I kept tagging it with #Althingi, #Althingi, and I actually started getting suggestions and even some likes from the actual governmental Twitter page for the Althingi government was liking some of the posts. So that was great. But the Althingi is one of the longest standing parliaments that we know of. It goes back to the 900s when Vikings were emigrating from Norway, from the British Isles. There was a lot of turmoil. Christianity from the mainland was spreading, and there was a lot of conflict between sort of the pagan cultures in Scandinavia and the kings who were bringing some new ideas, some new religions, some new ways of living. And the Althingi itself, it started just as a gathering of powerful people. And it was a reflection of the Old Norse law code, the way society was structured before sort of Christian monarchs came to take over Scandinavia. And so it's a fascinating glimpse into history. And the name is rather snappy and has a nice historical context. So Althingi literally is sort of the government of Iceland now, and was even in the Viking times. And so it's a back reference to that historical area. I know we both share an interest in history, and I'm sure we'll get into that, but that's where the name comes from.
Interesting. So did you ever get in contact with the government per se? Like you said, like you tagged Althingi. Did any opportunity come out of that? Did you connect with someone working with the government?
I didn't connect with an individual, but the actual parliament's Althingi Twitter page did like a few of the posts, and
Oh, okay.
several of my friends from Iceland and some of my new friends that I met through the campaign were very excited to see that this piece of Icelandic history is being featured in a board game. I think there's a sense sometimes in Iceland that people just think of Iceland, all they think of is kind of like horned helmet Vikings, and their history is so much more than that, especially the sagas open up this whole world of incredible sort of semi-mythic narratives of actual people in many cases who ended up being founders of Iceland. And I wanted to feature those through the game. And so they were really excited to see some characters they recognized. They were excited about the art and sort of more the historical portrayal. It was
Okay,
really
so
fun.
before we go into the historical aspect of it, which I'm curious about, of course, I want to ask you, how does a card game like Althingi come to be? Like, what was the first idea? How is it like an eureka moment where you're in the bathtub and you're like, I got it, Althingi, and you have it all sorted, or was it like more of a gradual thing, more of a gradual project?
That's a great question. Yeah, the creative process is so interesting. I think if you ask any creator about what their process is like, they're going to say something slightly different. But I think one thing that's consistent is that when you get yourself in that creative mindset, I'm a writer. I like writing stories. I'm also a game designer. I run a game design club here, and Althingi was not the first game I designed. There was sort of several games. A lot of it comes from just small ideas, writing them down, coming back to them later, maybe thinking about them. I'm a bit of an obsessive thinker, so when I get an idea, it really sort of takes hold. And yeah, Althingi was born out of kind of an obsession I had in university in my last few years,
Mm,
where I discovered a section of the library that was full of Norse myths and Icelandic sagas. I wasn't studying them academically. I was actually in university for an entirely separate program, but I think I cleared the dust off that entire shelf, as many books as I could, wrestled through some of the ones that were in Old Norse. My Old Norse is not very sharp, but the English translations especially, just devoured those. And in many senses, both the stories and the game were a bit of an outpouring of all this information that I had been taking in, these characters and these narratives, kind of these scenes and these images. And so in a sense, it was maybe less of a eureka moment and more just like my brain had all this in it and just kind of needed some sort of release. And so the game became a nice way to sort of process and express some of the things that I was excited about, that I was reading about these Icelandic sagas.
interesting. So definitely an outlet for creativity, right? Interesting. So does that mean you play card games or board games in your spare time? You said you're a game designer even before Althingi. What kind of games do you play, or what do you look for when you sit down to play a game, if you play games?
That's a great question. Yes, I love board games. Discovered board games maybe about 8 years ago. We had friends from the States actually who were doing school up here in Canada and brought with them a massive board game collection. I think they brought more games than like clothes or anything else. And so they introduced us to a lot of the sort of the newer wave of games. When a lot of people think of board games, they might think of things like Monopoly or Clue. And I don't mean to say anything bad against those types of games, but board games are really experiencing an amazing resurgence right now. Especially within the last maybe 10 years. It might be a response to, I think, in some cases, technology and how technology sort of taken over our lives. Board games are that sort of very tactile, sitting around the table with other human beings, right? Having conversations face to face, kind of facilitating that social interaction that we might not get or we might sort of crave or miss from times before. And so yeah, I love all sorts of games. I have a game group, which has not been meeting because of COVID, but before COVID,
Hmm.
I was very lucky to meet with them every Friday. And we would play games that would run the gambit of, 2 hours to, 4 to 5 hours. So fairly in-depth games. A lot of the games that come out on Kickstarter, we sometimes go together and back the games together. Recently, what were the last few we played? We played Everdell. We played the Conan the Barbarian board
Hmm.
game. We played. I love Blood Rage. Blood Rage is one of my favorites, being a Viking themed game as well. So I love the more in depth games. I'm willing to watch a half an hour how to play video and then sit down at the table for 3 or 4 hours. I love that sort of thing. Althingi is definitely not that kind of game. Althingi is much more of
Hmm.
a game to get newer players to the table. It's got enough of a mechanic to engage players with a bit more experience, but it's definitely a game to invite new people, to introduce people to this new world of games, which is emerging all the time. New games are coming out every month. It's incredible.
So then, what is the aim of a game like Althingi if it's not like a game that if it's for new players? What is the overall aim? Is it beyond perhaps having fun? Is it to educate? Is it to instruct? Is it to shed a light on a part of history, a period of history that we don't know much about?
That's a great question. I'm going to say like yes to all of those things. But first and foremost, it's a game. And I think that's maybe one mistake that I see from maybe coming from an educational background myself. I know I have some colleagues who have tried to make educational games. And the problem was that it was education first and game second. If you're going to make a game, it's got to be a game first. It's got to be sound mechanically. It's got to be engaging. It's got to be airtight in terms of the rules. You need to play test the heck out of it. Have people break it, remake it, break it, remake it, and it's got to look good. It's got to be a commercially viable product that people want to buy and that people get excited about. So it's definitely a game first. I strove to make it as clean as possible. I know that some of the games that I like to play are fairly complex in terms of mechanics, which can be fine. But I think you can also, as a game designer, make some interesting mechanics that are a little bit more simple. I think of like the game of chess as a classic example. If chess is not overly complicated in terms of mechanics, how the pieces move, but the results, the games that can ensue from just two players sitting down with the same setup, right? Millions of different games can play out, and that's kind of the mechanic, more of the kind of mechanic I was striving for with Althingi.
Interesting. So let's jump into historical accuracy and related to the question of gameplay. Did you ever have to make some sort of historical concessions in order to make the game better? I know, for example, that happens in video games, that happens in board games, where you go beyond thinking about history and then you put the game first. Did you ever have to make a concession where you were like, okay, the history is this, but if we went this route, it would make the game more interesting?
Yeah, you know what? I'm going to say yes, but maybe not in the way most people might expect. So the first thing I'm going to say is that we are all making concessions looking back at history because we all have, we grew up in a cultural context. We have a certain narrative view of history, and we have sort of beliefs and biases, and all those things color the way we look at history. So nobody is sitting, in their, leather chair, smoking their pipe with a completely objective view of history and kind of examining it that way. I mean, we strive to do that, but history is a subjective experience in my opinion, because we all bring so much to the table and we're viewing it through our own lens. So that would be my kind of starting thing. The concessions I had to make really were just cutting back all the things I wanted to include in the game. I mean, when you write, for example, a novel, like when I write books, you have 100,000 words to kind of bring people into a world. And even that doesn't feel like a lot of space when you're writing. It might sound like a lot, but there's still so much you cut out. You talk about a board game that's going to play in 20 to 25 minutes with a mechanic that people can pick up in 3 to 4 minutes. I mean, you were looking at such a narrow slice of such a broad and rich history that you really have to be selective. And I think the aim for me in the end is not to have people play this game and walk away from the table with a full understanding of what it was like to live in medieval Iceland. I think it's more of sort of that spark of getting them interested, making them realize there were some fascinating characters. Maybe not everybody wore horned helmets and swung axes all the time, right? There was a lot of women in the Icelandic sagas, and a lot of women are featured in the game. They're very important in the stories, and they're very influential in the founding of Iceland. All these sorts of things I wanted to bring to the game, but it was tough because there's just such a narrow slice of that history that you're able to actually engage with without drowning the reader in a rule book that weighs 3 pounds and a game that takes 6 hours to play. So it was tough. It was tough.
So you've said you based Althingi on your passion for Norse saga, or for the tales, the myths. Did you consult anyone with this? Did you seek assistance to perhaps experts? And how was that process of negotiating what is interesting to your game?
Great question. So this didn't happen. This wasn't a project that I kind of decided I wanted to make a game based in Iceland, and then I sat down and made a list of books I was going to read. Like, it wasn't like that. I was literally just every single book I could get my hand on, whether it was a translation, whether it was a commentary, or whether a podcast that I was listening to. I was trying to soak it all in. Through that process and through writing the book, I got in touch with several people, some who were writers, some who were game designers, some who were professors in Old Norse poetry, Old Norse history, Viking archaeological studies. And through conversations with them, each of those conversations kind of helped to shed a light on different things. The historical aspect of the game is such a narrow slice that I really had to be selective. And there was some good feedback that I got from especially different academics who are also involved in games. A large portion of the iteration process that was dedicated to getting the mechanic to work well, spending time on the layout, figuring out how we're going to use the cards in the most efficient way to be able to do the most things, working with the artist. And so while the history is definitely a centering and sort of a framing aspect to the game, I wouldn't say that was like the majority of kind of what needed to be polished up as the game was developed.
Interesting. Before we move on to PlayStation play testing and the game itself, I want to ask you, what's the best feedback you've received in terms of the history of the game, or like what's one thing that surprised you about perhaps Iceland and Icelandic culture that you didn't know before, and you know now after making the game?
Great question. So one of the things I learned a lot about through the process of creating the game was about fabrics and garb. I didn't have a lot of experience in that. There's a very active and quite academically focused group of Viking reenactors here in North America as well as in Europe, and the artist actually is an active reenactor herself, and they will talk to you for hours about like what threads were used, what the sources would it have been wool, if there was a certain color, like how would they've gotten that dye, what sort of plants would have grown in that region. And so I was so glad to sort of bring her on board and have her expertise for that sort of thing, and I learned a lot. One of the things that I really enjoyed hearing about was women's garb. Of course, in Viking themed fiction, that is kind of the one of the major sort of tropes, right? Is this sort of like Viking woman in this like leather bikini. Obviously, nobody was wearing bikinis back in the Viking Age. It was very cold. It still is cold. I've been to Norway and Iceland. You definitely want to pack your sweater. But I was really fascinated to learn about some of the garb pieces for a traditional woman's outfit. One of them would include a ring of keys, and the larger the ring of keys, the more keys that were on the chain. That was sort of a status symbol. And so if a woman had a large set of keys and they were ornate, perhaps they had sort of intricate designs or gems in them, that would signify that she was part of a very powerful household and in charge of quite a bit, responsible for a large number of things. From the archaeology side, there's also these incredible brooches which they would use to secure their garments at the shoulder, which are really incredible. They're sort of like oval clasps, and the designs of these things are just totally extravagant. It's amazing to think that in that time there were smiths that were skilled enough in silverwork or whatever other sort of metals they were using to craft these things, to be able to make such beautiful pieces of jewelry. We often think of Vikings just sort of like wearing fur and leather, which I'm sure they did, but they also had a sense of fashion. So yeah.
And this is all represented in your game and your game's art, right?
Correct. Yeah.
Okay, let's speak about the game itself then. Beyond the historical accuracy, let's focus on the game aspect of it. How was playtesting it like? You said you had a group of friends that you gathered with. How did you playtest it together with them? Did you require the help of someone else, maybe an outsider to the project? How did that go?
Oh, dozens of people, dozens of playtests. Yeah, so I help to run a playtesting group here in the city I live in. I'm also connected with other playtesting groups in on the West Coast here and in Canada. And so, yeah, I had several opportunities to take this game to different playtesting conventions, to different playtesting groups. Through COVID, we did a little bit of playtesting online, though by that point in time, thankfully, the game was pretty much ready to go. But yeah, no, playtesting, I can't emphasize enough how important that is. It's the classic experience of a first-time game designer to have that, like you were talking about, that sort of aha moment of a brilliant idea for a game. Maybe you sketch it up, maybe you create a little prototype, and you won't see any flaw with it. It's just the most brilliant game, and it's going to blow everyone's minds. And you throw it on the table, and within the first 3 minutes, somebody's broken it. There's some flaw in the mechanic, and the game is broken. And so you go to the table and you sort of pick up the pieces and you kind of glue it back together and you try to fix what was broken. And that's what you do. This was a process of probably at least a year and a half, if not 2 years, of just playtesting and playtesting and playtesting. I've got a bit of a background in graphic design as well. So I was also, after the artist had created the art assets, I was laying them out on the cards, and I did a lot of work on rearranging sort of where the cards were, the font size, the runic symbols that are used in the game. I wanted to make sure those were placed in strategic ways so that people could understand the symbology of what they meant in the game and how to use them. So yeah, no, it was a long process, enjoyable, frustrating at times. And I have so many people to thank for the game that it is today.
Sounds like a fun experience. So you said it took you 2 years, but before we go to how long the entire project took you, which is something I want to ask you about, what would be the number one advice you would have for game designers, for people who are willing to get into game design, or even for playtesters? You know, here at the lab, we foster both designers and playtesters. What would be your number one advice?
So for playtesters, first I will say there are leagues of game designers just desperate to find playtesters to playtest their games. If you're interested in playtesting games, playtesting groups would be so glad to have you. And in fact, sometimes, especially if you're somebody who is into board games, it's really nice to have someone who's not just like your cousin or your neighbor who's not really that interested in games. That's helpful feedback. But someone who plays regularly, somebody who's got experience with a wide variety of mechanics, they can give you some feedback. Sometimes it's a little more focused and useful. Even better, if you're a designer, getting other designers to play the game, they can consider things like, for example, costs of components. So for example, playtesters would often say something to me like, oh, wouldn't it be so cool if you added like, a 3D map and little miniature figures that you could paint and, custom dice for this. And, every single one of those things factors into the cost of the game, which is a really important aspect of game design, because it's always easy to add costs, but to keep costs down is really challenging. For game designers, I would say look up a local game design group. The community of game designers, in my experience, has been fabulous. All the way from people who like to design, just free print and play stuff. They'll just sort of take, clip art off the internet, and they make these really cool mechanics, and they'll put it up online for people to play for free. That's really awesome. To people who want to publish professionally, either through Kickstarter or through other companies. And I've got amazing responses from people all over. There's a lot of support. People passionate about games are happy to teach you, to give you suggestions on how to change things or how to market your game or how to publish it. So yeah, it's a great community.
Thank you so much for that. Yeah, I think that will come in handy for us. Okay, so back to the project itself, but back to Althingi. So you said playtesting took you about 2 years. How long do you reckon did the entire process take you? I mean, playtesting and then artwork and design. How long are we talking to? 3 years maybe in total?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I guess it depends when you would say start and finish. So from the very first drafting, my first prototype, to let's say the publication of the Kickstarter was about 3.5, let's call it 4 years.
Oh, that was a lot.
So yeah, it was not a short process. And from other designers that I've talked to, that's pretty standard, at least 2 or 3 years. If you're working with a professional publisher, maybe a little bit quicker than that if they're hiring out artists and they're paying playtesters to playtest your game a little more quickly. But no, it's an investment for sure. It doesn't happen overnight, and it really makes you appreciate when you sit down and play a game like I had mentioned Blood Rage before. I love that game. You sit down and play a game like that, you can appreciate how many hours, how many years went into the design of something like that.
I know Althingi is not a solo endeavor because you have an illustrator, Lada Shustova. How was collaborating with them? How was it? Because Althingi is, as far as I'm concerned, your baby, and as far as the Kickstarter was concerned, your baby. How was it giving your baby away to an illustrator? How was that collaboration?
Great question. And you're correct. This was definitely my baby. And I did some things that designers are not supposed to do. So most designers of board games do not handle the arts or the layouts or anything like that. If you are a game designer, the classic route is that you kind of create a workable prototype. Could even be you like just sketching things on paper. Maybe you use Photoshop to kind of make some cards from art off the internet. You pitch it at an event. For example, there's a big conference called Shucks out here in Western Canada, and so I had a chance to go and I pitched to publishers there. And they're basically looking for a mechanic. And in many cases, they don't want you to touch the art because they, as a publishing company, have sort of a look. They've got an aesthetic. And if they like your game, they'll take it, they'll polish it up a bit, and they'll put their own artwork on it to make it sort of jive with the library that they have of games currently. So my sort of meddling with the art and doing the design, this was a bit of a thing that most designers don't do. It was a bit of a Hail Mary, as we might say, because I wasn't just bringing a mechanic to a publisher. I was bringing a mechanic and sort of a fully finished art. And the reason I did that is because I wanted to be involved in the steps my worst nightmare would have been to have done all this sort of background research and consulting with my academic friends, with my historical reenactor friends, only to hand it over to a publisher who ends up publishing something that looks a little bit like Conan the Barbarian. No hate against Conan the Barbarian, but yeah, for that to kind of all kind of go by the wayside. So I wanted to be involved in the artistic process, I should say. Lada was incredible. With her background in Viking reenactment, she was really excited about the project. I could tell she had that sort of that fire and excitement that I had too. And working with her was great. And the publisher I ended up going with, Outland Entertainment. Loved the concept, loved the idea, and so was also very supportive. And I'm very lucky in that I didn't feel like I had to make too many sort of artistic sacrifices or sort of changes to the original game. And I'm really proud to say that I think the game really captures what I was going for.
Yeah, so your vision was definitely realized. There's nothing left on the table. Joshua, we spoke a lot about Kickstarter and this being a fully backed project on Kickstarter. For listeners who might have no idea what Kickstarter is, how would you explain it to them? What is Kickstarter?
Great question. So Kickstarter is a crowdfunding platform, very popular over here in North America. I believe in Europe too. Yeah. There's a fair number of projects that get funded that way. And the idea is that you pitch a project and you're just pitching it to the public and you're saying, I would really like to create this awesome thing. Would you buy it? And people have the option to make pledges, which are monetary commitments to the project that could be from varying levels. You can just donate a few dollars if you believe in the project and you want to see it happen. You can, for example, in the case of Althingi, you could buy the game. And we had several upgrades. So there was like a metal coin that was another level of pledge. And there was a coin and a neoprene playmat that you could play on. That was another one. And so it's a really neat option for creators and artists, I think, because it's quite a gambit to run with traditional publishers, particularly with books, to kind of get an idea all the way through. It has to go past, agents and editors and then marketing people. And a lot of really good stories, I think, don't make it to the finish line because of that. And that's just the nature of the industry. That's neither here nor there. With board games, though, one thing that's really unique is the best board games out there, in my opinion, the highest quality, the best produced games, the biggest selling ones are on Kickstarter. And it's a really unique thing about the board game community is that the games that get produced are not games typically, being decided by marketing executives in a big metal and glass skyscraper. It's fans who get to decide. And so these projects, Althingi ran into the thousands of dollars. These projects run into the tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars, and that's American. And they happen because of people's excitement and support. And from the designer side, it's really exciting because if you feel like you have an idea like myself as an individual designer, of course, I paired up with a publisher. That was a big help in the process. You can make these sort of things happen where if you can get the word out, if you can get enough people excited, you might be able to get your project funded. It's not an easy process. It's a lot of work. I think many people look at Kickstarter and say, oh, I've got this idea. If I just throw it up there, I'll get $10,000 and I can produce my game. It's not easy, but it's very rewarding. And it's really cool to be able to connect with fans of Viking history and of board games from all over the world. I think we had backers from almost every single continent, and messages from people from all over the world just saying like, "Oh, this is so cool! I want to learn more about Icelandic history." Yeah.
So interesting how everything is fan backed on Kickstarter. How was dealing with Kickstarter, the organization, the company itself? Was it you that did the negotiations? What did you set up the page, or was that your publisher? Was that Outland Entertainment instead?
Great question. So this is one thing, if you're going to run a Kickstarter, you're interested in doing this, that you've got to know is that when you sign up with Kickstarter, they take a portion of the funds. That's how they run. So they are very invested in having your project succeed, because when you get funded, then they also benefit. So I didn't work directly too much with Kickstarter, though I ran the campaign. I was in on the page. Outland did some of the layout. I did some of the art for the Kickstarter page. If you go there, you can still see it. And that was a lot of work to set up, but definitely worth it. Of course, you've got to present your game in a professional manner. I mean, you're asking for people to back you monetarily, so you've got to show that what you're putting forward is worth backing. You've got to get them excited about what's happening. Really show off the best of what's there. And I would say in charge of running the campaign, though the publisher helped by putting out the word on newsletters. They got a few features with different podcasts and websites. And the more people you can reach, the better, because, for every, I don't want to sound too dismal about this, but like for every 1,000 people that hear about it who think it's interesting, probably only one will back it. So like literally, I think your reach needs to be in at least tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, if you're going to do that, which is possible through social media today. But you have to be smart about how you do it. And you have to recognize that you're competing not only for people's attention amid sort of social media and news and other things that are going on, but even on Kickstarter. That's one thing we found the month that we ran Althingi. There was a lot of really good games coming out from really good publishers. And I was sort of watching comment threads ahead of our campaign launch date, and they were saying there's so many good games coming out this month. Maybe I just won't back any because I just can't decide. And I was thinking, oh no, this is bad. But we ended up finding 196 people who were excited about the project, and we funded. So that was good.
So let's speak about the success of Althingi then. So as you said, you had 196 backers, which have pledged almost around $9,000 in 22 days, which is really, really good. What do you think, or what do you hope the success of Althingi will mean to games like it? How do you see things changing from here?
Edward, I think you were probably interested in this too, but views of specifically Vikings in history is extremely problematic right now, and has been, for the past century, for multiple different reasons, mostly political, in that people have these views of Vikings that are often very, very inaccurate, very sort of like racially charged, very sort of just completely and wholly sort of detached from what history actually was. And so I was really encouraged to find that many people who backed the thing they found most exciting about it was that it was a more historical depiction of Vikings than they're finding in other games. And so, for example, games like Blood Rage. I love Blood Rage, but that's an extremely sort of fantastical version of Vikings and what Vikings would have been like. And they're not trying to be historical. They're trying to be fantastic. But you'll find even often TV shows or comic books are often portraying Vikings in ways that are fairly skewed historically, not always in sort of like politically nefarious ways, but which can often sort of be led into sort of darker places. So I wanted to challenge some of those narratives. I wanted to get people excited about getting into actual Viking history, to reading about it. I think they'd be surprised a lot of times to read about the Vikings, sort of like what they actually did according to the sagas. And I think that might help sort of give people a more balanced view of what happened there. As somebody of Scandinavian descent myself, my family's from Norway on my dad's side. This is obviously like a sort of a bit of a family history project for me too, because for whatever reason, I just at one point needed to sort of dig into my family's past, and this is kind of what got me on the Norse myths. And I was both excited by what I was reading and also really disturbed about how a lot of these characters and a lot of these narratives had been kind of passed down culturally and were sort of being spread by certain groups. So I really hope that the success of Althingi is a signal that people are open to that sort of conversation, that there's an excitement around learning a bit of the broader, more in-depth picture of what happened to the Vikings. And there are other projects planned. Althingi has a platform called Worlds, and so Althingi is now one of the outline worlds, and we'll be building out more projects in that world. For example, in March, we've got an anthology of historical fiction coming out, edited by myself and my good friend Muhammad Ahmed, who edited A Mosque Among the Stars, as well as 𝐿𝐿amikit. And he's an Islamic sci-fi writer. I'm a Viking fantasy writer. So imagine these two writers coming together. We've become really good friends through this process, and we are editing this anthology of what we're calling intersectional historical fiction, which takes a look at the interactions between the Vikings and the Islamic states at the time, particularly the scholars who were being sent by as emissaries to distant places in the known world at the time. And people often are a little bit shocked by this. Vikings, Muslims, there's no crossover there. But I always like to remind them, the only first-hand account we have of Vikings is from Ibn Fadlan, who traveled north from
Mm.
Baghdad, who observed Vikings up the Volga River and gave us really important counts, including things like the Viking burial in a ship at sea, where the warriors laid in the ship and it's cast out to sea and then it's burned. So yeah, it's been really fun to explore that. We've brought on some great authors, and I'm hoping the success of the Althingi game can spur success on that project, as well as an expansion I have planned for the game coming out hopefully later this summer.
Yeah, for everyone interested in all of Joshua's projects, I will have links to them in our show notes. So please make sure to check those out. I want to ask you again about our interpretations about Vikings. So your campaign ran from mid-late November to early December, right? Because I love video games, I know Assassin's Creed Valhalla was a game that came out at the exact same time. How do you look at that project at that project and say, what do you say about it? Is that historically accurate or is it not? And how do you think it had any impact on Althingi? Or like, I know in a lot of media nowadays, there's a lot of Norse mythology or like TV shows, video games, comic books that like have somehow found Norse mythology and now are trying to do something with it. How did that have an impact on what you were doing with Althingi?
Oh, there's definitely a connection. I mean, there's a bit of sort of Viking zeitgeist, I think, right now. A lot of it, I think, kicked off with the Vikings History Channel TV show. Say what you want about it. Some people love it, some people don't. The Last Kingdom on Netflix, once again, kind of spurred interest in that. Even Game of Thrones, to some point, spurred interest in fantasy again, sort of making it a bit more mainstream. Revival of a lot of sort of, Lord of the Rings fans. I know Amazon's got a new series coming out, so it's definitely sort of in the air. And the release of Assassin's Creed definitely helped. I'm in the sphere of Dr. Jackson Crawford, who was one of the historical kind of lead historical references. He's an academic from the States on that game, and so they did a lot of work with him. And he's got a great YouTube channel where he talks about all sorts of Norse related things, both translations and history and culture. And so I know they really did their research, and they're known in that series, the Assassin's Creed series, for really doing their homework. I also love their Black Flag was incredible. I'm a big fan of pirate history and learning about that, and the fact you can explore these towns and there's historical characters sort of just sprinkled in everywhere is very cool. So I think the Assassin's Creed series in general has done a lot for excitement about history, about specific periods in time, and I hope it does the same for Vikings. I myself do not have a next generation console, so I haven't played it yet, but I've heard great things, and I see lots of things being posted on Twitter and elsewhere on the internet about it. So I'm excited. And once again, it's opening up that conversation of, who were the Vikings historically? In one sense, that can be difficult in a way because it challenges maybe some of the things we've held on to, like the fact, or like, beliefs like the Vikings had no fear, or, beliefs like the Vikings were, just ruthless barbarians. Those are not true, and these historical narratives challenge that. But they also kind of give us a deeper and richer understanding of who these people were. And I think that could be really valuable.
I remember, like as you say, like 10 years ago, it was very much like, oh, barbarians. In a lot of RPGs and a lot of like this sort of media, they are the barbarians, the tanks, the heavy wielders, the dual wielders in many instances. And I'm excited to see that with Althingi, you've gone against that. So let's speak about Althingi's roadmap from now on. So we are now at the time of this recording. We are now in February. You said Althingi has you have an expansion plan for it in March.
Yes, correct. So, and this is once again a whole sort of conversation in the world of game design that players don't often get to see. But the game was funded in November. We got the final art assets together, kind of did the final polish, including all the things that were funded through the Kickstarter, some of the expansions and stretch goals, and we sent that to the printer. It's actually a holiday as we're speaking right now in China, and so it's on hold. But right after the holiday, it's scheduled to be printed. And barring any shipping delays, which we're hoping there are not, I know last year shipping delays really threw a wrench into a lot of game publishers' schedules because a lot of games get printed in Asia and then get shipped to the States. Whenever that sort of chain of communication breaks down or the shipping routes get interrupted, that impacts the board game community quite a bit. We're hoping for nothing like that. It should be sent to the warehouse and should be shipped. We're hoping to be on schedule, if not even a bit ahead of schedule. So from there, yeah, I've planned an expansion. I'd already worked on it a bit. before the campaign had launched. I'd had the idea sort of rolling around in my mind. And the expansion is called 𝐂𝐴𝐬𝐲𝐫𝐢𝐲𝐲. So it's Althingi 𝐂𝐴𝐬𝐲𝐲𝐫𝐢𝐲, and it brings in 10 characters from actual Icelandic sagas. So names you'd recognize like Eric the Red, Leif Erikson, Guthrum the Far Traveler. If you're interested or familiar with Icelandic sagas, you'll know those names, as well as a few others, and as well as some new mechanics. There are some special cards. There's a new field card. Fields play an important part as the players gather in this field in Iceland. There's also loot cards, and so there's a unique loot card that will throw a wrench into things as people are trying to bribe Vikings to join their camp and challenge other Vikings to battles or home gangs. So I'm excited to launch that, and there's a lot of excitement, I think, from backers of the original game. It'll be a smaller Kickstarter as it's just an expansion, and I'm hoping that goes off maybe even sometime this summer.
So this summer is the projected time for that. When are you thinking about launching the Kickstarter page?
So the anthology that I mentioned earlier is already set for March 9th. So we're going to run that from March 9th to April 1st. And that's historical fiction based on the characters from the game, which is really cool. So we gave each author a character from the game, and they kind of wrote a backstory as to why they'd shown up at the Althingi, and sort of explore some of the relationships they may have had, some of the interactions with some of the Islamic states, which were actually really powerful at the same time. There's kind of this buffer of Christianity between the Vikings and the Islamic states, but both of them, the Islamic scholars and the Vikings, were known for wanting to travel, for having a hunger and a thirst for discovery and for knowledge. And so they definitely interacted, and that's a fun feature. And I'm hoping for the expansion for 𝐂𝐴𝐬𝐲𝐫𝐢𝐲, possibly July, possibly August. I don't want to say a set date yet, as these things always tend to take a little bit longer than you think they would, but I'm hoping sometime this summer.
Perfect. And what comes after Althingi, after the expansion, after the series? More card games like it? More books? I know obviously you've planned more books in the Gatewatch series, but what can we expect more? What kind of projects can we expect from you in the coming months, years? Where's your head at?
That's a great question. Definitely more projects. I'm not sure I can give you specifics on those quite yet. My big focus in the last few years, and by few I mean 4 or 5, because that's how long it's taken for the book and for the game. My big focus is just to finish things. I've always been sort of creative and had ideas and sort of started projects here and there, but it's only within the last few years I've really been able to kind of set myself on a track to finish things. So it's a big sort of personal deal for me to have this game be funded and to be out to actual players, for it to hit the table, because that means that it is complete. And so I'm looking forward to new things. I have a few ideas, a few prototypes. I've always got 3 or 4 kind of on the back burner, so we'll see which ones sort of emerge as the winners. And hopefully more games, probably Viking themed, as I love Vikings. So definitely more games, definitely more books.
Joshua, if you were a game designer starting today, if you were in university in doing your master's degree, and then you have a few months before you graduate, where would you start from? What's your advice to people who want to get into game design, or want to get into anything that you do, be it playtesting, or even designing, because you said you were involved in that? How do you start? What's the first step?
Great question. I would say the first step is join a game design group. You'd be amazed, even in small cities, there's often like 2 or 3 dozen game designers that may meet regularly, either online now because of COVID or in person. Game shops, board game shops are often a hub for game designers, especially if they're board game cafes. That's a big thing over here. Often designers will meet up there. So I'd say connect with your local game design group. Even if you don't have a fully fleshed out idea, go and play test some other games that are sort of in development, see what the process is like. Or if you have an idea, make a prototype. If you're just cutting it out on paper and drawing, on sticky notes, that's fine, right? If you want to invest a little bit more and maybe make some cards or a little board to play with, then make it, bring it, put it on the table, see what they say. The process only begins once you've got a game on the table. So that's the first step, I think, is to connect with other designers.
Thank you so much. I think you've shared so much good advice. I'm very excited for our listeners to get to hear this. Where could they find you if they want to find more about you?
I have a website, joshuagillingham.ca, and you can find out information about my books, about my games. I host a blog there as well where I interview writers. So if you're interested in the world of writing, you can learn a bit about that. You can also find more about Althingi and those projects on the Outland Entertainment website. My books are published through Crow's Nest Books, and that's crowsnestbooks.com. They're a publisher here in Canada. Those are the 3 sites. So joshuagillingham.ca, Outland.com and crowsnestbooks.com.
Yes, and for listeners, I will make sure, again, like before, I will add these links to the show notes so you have easy access to them. Joshua, thank you so much for joining me. If there's one thing that you would like to emphasize before we go.
Thanks so much for having me. If there's one thing I'd like to emphasize, I would like to emphasize that the Vikings were a fascinating culture, and if you're interested in Vikings, I would encourage you to enjoy your comic books, enjoy your Marvel movies and stuff like that. But go back, read some of the Icelandic sagas, some of the stories they told about themselves, and you get a glimpse of a world that kind of seems like another planet, but was not really that long ago.
Joshua, it was wonderful to learn more about Althingi. Again, this was a Kickstarter project that was already fully funded, is already fully funded, about to come out this May. In terms of future episodes from this podcast, everyone, join us next month for our next episode of the podcast. We are still awaiting confirmation as to what exactly the topic will be. But again, similar to what we got you used to, if this month we were speaking about history and historical accuracy in card games, next month we might do something similar or something along the lines of. As for what we have coming through for you from the History and Games Lab in general, our next seminar is going to be on the 26th February at 5 p.m. British time, and it's called Deus Vult Ex Machina, the Crusades in Strategy Computer Games. And that's going to be a talk given by Robert Horton from the University of Winchester. Please feel free to reach out to us if you have any feedback or would like to get in touch for a potential podcast appearance. Our DMs are open on Twitter at @HandGLab, or you can email us at historyangames.studentgroup@mlist.is.ed.ac.uk, or email me personally at eduardgafton@gmail.com. Again, all of these links, a big bulky description in the show notes with all of these links await you. In addition to Twitter, we are also on Instagram at HandGLab, and we have a Facebook page simply named History and Games Lab. This all being said, do consider connecting with us in order to stay up to date with our activities and our future events. Thank you so much. This was all from us. Until next time, everyone. Thank you. Bye. The Edinburgh University History and Games Lab podcast is a production of the Edinburgh University History and Games Lab. For more on us and future podcasts, connect with us on Twitter, Instagram, and or Facebook by searching for Edinburgh University History and Games Lab, which should be the first result. Music for today's episode is Call to Adventure by Kevin MacLeod, used under filmmusic.io standard license. For more information on the link and the license, please check the show notes. Thank you for listening, and please join us next time.